The wind off the Iglothian peaks did not merely blow, it bit. It was a whetted razor of ice that flayed the skin and sought the marrow of a man's bones. Conan of Cimmeria moved through the high passes like a shadow cast by a storm cloud. His massive frame was wrapped in heavy furs, his face a grim mask of bronze, half hidden by a frost-rimed hood. He did not feel the cold as a civilized man might, with whining and trembling. To him, it was an old adversary, a stern teacher from his youth in the northern hills. Beneath his feet, the snow groaned, a dry, protesting sound. He followed a trail of trampled slush and dark, frozen droplets that looked like black garnets strewn across the white waste. It was the blood of his kin. A war party of yellow-haired Vanir had descended upon a Cimmerian hunting camp 3 days prior, burning what would not burn and stealing what could not be easily replaced. But it was not the stolen grain or the furs that had brought Conan into this desolate height. It was a debt of steel. He crested a jagged ridge, his blue eyes narrowing against the glare of the pale winter sun. Below him lay a valley that seemed to have been gouged out of the earth by the thumb of a mad god. It was a bowl of gray granite and obsidian, sheltered from the swirling snows by towering cliffs that leaned inward like mourning hags. There, at the mouth of the descent, Conan found the first omen. A Vanir scout sat slumped against a boulder. He was a giant of a man, his red beard matted with frozen breath. His hand still gripped the hilt of his broadsword, but the weapon remained in its sheath. Conan approached with the silent, predatory grace of a mountain panther, his own sword, a heavy, double-edged length of blue-tempered steel, half drawn. The Cimmerian stopped. There was no need for caution. The Vanir was dead. Conan leaned in, his nostrils flaring. There was no scent of decay in this freezing air, only the metallic tang of old blood. But as he inspected the body, his thick black brows knitted together. The man had no wounds. No arrow protruded from his throat, no axe had split his mail. Yet his face was a distorted map of agony. His eyes were wide, the pupils blown into black voids of terror, and his mouth was locked in a wide, silent scream. A dark, frozen crust coated the man's ears. Conan reached out a calloused finger and touched the scout's lobe. It was brittle. The eardrum had been shattered from the inside out, as if by a pressure too great for the flesh to bear. "Crom," Conan muttered, the word a low growl in his throat. He looked toward the valley floor. The wind, which had been howling through the crags with the fury of a wounded beast, suddenly began to die. It did not fade as a breeze usually does. It strangled. Conan stepped past the dead Vanir and crossed the invisible threshold into the valley. The transition was as jarring as a blow to the solar plexus. One moment, the world was a cacophony of whistling gale, the crunch of snow, and the heavy thud of his own pulse in his ears. The next, there was nothing. The silence was not merely an absence of noise, it was a physical weight. It pressed against his chest, thick and suffocating like a wet shroud. Conan stopped and drew a sharp breath. He felt the air enter his lungs, felt the expansion of his ribs, but the sound of his inhalation, the familiar raspy whistle of breath, was gone. He looked up. Above the rim of the valley, he could see the tops of the pines swaying violently in the storm, their branches lashing like whips. They should have been roaring. Instead, They moved in a ghostly, cinematic pantomime. Conan pulled his sword fully from its scabbard. He expected the familiar, comforting shring of steel against leather. There was only the sensation of the weight shifting in his hand. He swung the blade, cutting the air with a powerful horizontal stroke. Usually, the air would hiss in protest of such speed. Now, there was only a void. A grim coldness that had nothing to do with the weather settled in Conan's gut. He knew the legends of this place. The Cimmerian elders called it the Hush of Crom, a pocket of the world where the god of the mountain had supposedly breathed out his final bit of mercy, leaving behind a vacuum where no prayer could be heard and no cry for help could reach the heavens. Conan knelt and picked up a fist-sized stone. He cast it with all his strength against the sheer obsidian wall of the cliff. He watched the rock strike the dark surface. He saw it shatter into a dozen fragments. No crack echoed, no pebble rattled as it fell. The silence swallowed the impact whole, leaving the world feeling fragile and unreal, as if he had stepped out of life and into a painting of hell. He stood, his knuckles white around the hilt of his sword. His survival instincts, honed in 1,000 bloody skirmishes from the Vilayet to the Western Ocean, screamed at him to turn back. This was a place for ghosts and nameless things that crawled in the dark spaces between the stars. But the trail of the Vanir continued into the heart of the stillness. They were moving deeper into the valley, driven perhaps by the same madness that had burst the ears of their scout. And Conan, fueled by a stubborn Cimmerian brand of wrath, would not let them escape, even if he had to hunt them into the very gullet of the abyss. He adjusted his grip on his blade and began to descend, his footsteps making no sound upon the iron earth. In the hush of Crom, Conan the Barbarian was no longer a man. He was a ghost of vengeance, moving through a world that had forgotten how to scream. The absence of sound was not a void, it was a presence. As Conan moved deeper into the valley, the silence began to exert a rhythmic pressure against his temples, a gelatinous weight that felt as though he were walking at the bottom of a stagnant sea. To a man of the hills, silence was usually a tool, a shroud used to stalk the stag or the enemy. But this was a perversion of nature. Without the external anchor of the wind's moan or the crunch of gravel, Conan's own body became a cathedral of unwanted noise. The lub-dub of his heart sounded like the rhythmic thumping of a war drum in a vaulted cellar. He could hear the liquid slide of his eyes in their sockets as he scanned the horizon, and the dry, tectonic grinding of his vertebrae with every turn of his head. Each breath was a subterranean gust, a wet, internal whistle that only he could perceive. It was enough to drive a man to madness. A civilized man, raised in the babbling marketplaces of Zamora or the perfumed courts of Aquilonia, would have been screaming within the hour, if only to hear the vibration in his own throat. But Conan was a Cimmerian. He came from a race that knew the value of a closed mouth. Crom, he thought, his mind the only place where his voice still held its iron resonance. The priests of the south say their gods demand hymns and chanting. They build great halls of marble just to trap the sound of their own voices. But you, old man of the mountain, you truly understand the world. You give a man life and the will to kill, and then you turn your back. This valley is your cathedral, a place of no breath and no mercy. He rounded a jagged outcrop of obsidian that rose from the earth like a frozen wave. There, huddled in a depression in the rock, he found the Vanir. The sight was pathetic. These were men of the North Rivers who lived for the roar of the mead hall and the thunder of the shield wall. Now they were shadows of men. There were 6 of them left, clustered around the remains of a fire that had long since died. They had not attempted to rekindle it. Perhaps the sight of wood burning without the comforting crackle of flames had been more than their fraying nerves could endure. They sat in a tight, defensive circle, their backs to one another. Their yellow hair was matted with filth, and their eyes were wide, bloodshot orbs that rolled incessantly in their sockets. They were looking for something they could not hear. Conan did not hide. He stepped into the center of the depression, his broadsword held low at his side. The Vanir chieftain, a massive brute named Thorsir, whose face was scarred by a dozen raids, bolted to his feet. His mouth opened, his chest heaving as he prepared to let out a roar of defiance that would have curdled the blood of a lesser foe. The silence swallowed the shout before it could leave his lips. Thorsir's face turned purple, his neck veins bulging like cords, his throat working with the frantic effort of a man being strangled by an invisible hand. He clutched at his own neck, tears of pure frustration and terror springing to his eyes. To a Vanir, a man without his voice was already a ghost. The other warriors scrambled up, drawing their notched axes and rusted swords. There was no ring of steel, only the visual flash of gray metal caught in the pale light. They looked at Conan, and for a moment the primal fear of the silence was eclipsed by the primal fear of the Cimmerian. They knew him. He was the black-haired devil who had dogged their heels across the tundra. In any other land, this would have been the moment for a parley of insults, for the boastful claims of warriors before the red dance of death began. Instead, they stood in a hideous pantomime standoff. Conan saw Thorsir's lips move, shaping a curse or a command, but no air carried the vibration. The chieftain's eyes pleaded for a sound, any sound. Conan took a step forward. He did not sneer. He felt only a grim, cold contempt. These men had brought fire to his people's camps. They had slaughtered the old and the weak. If the gods had stripped them of their voices before he could strip them of their lives, it was a small irony in a world of cruel jests. One of the younger Vanir, his mind finally snapping under the pressure of the hush, lunged forward. He did not attack with the discipline of a soldier. He swung his axe with the wild, flailing desperation of a man trying to hack his way out of a nightmare. Conan moved. He did not waste effort on a flourish. He stepped inside the arc of the axe, his own blade a blur of blue-gray steel. The sword bit into the Vanir's ribs, sliding through mail and bone as if they were wet parchment. In the world outside, there would have been the wet thwack of the strike, the grunt of the dying man, and the clatter of the axe falling to the stones. Here, there was only the sensation of resistance against Conan's palm. The warrior fell, his mouth agape in a final mute protest, his blood spilling onto the gray frost in a dark, spreading stain that looked like spilled wine. The other Vanir froze. They stared at their fallen comrade, then back at Conan. The Cimmerian stood over the body, his face as implacable as the stone cliffs surrounding them. He raised his sword, signaling for the rest to come. But even as Thorsier braced himself to lead the charge, a change drifted over the valley. The pressure in the air didn't lift, it intensified. A shadow, vast and jagged, rippled across the camp. It was not the shadow of a cloud. It moved with a jerky, unnatural rhythm. Conan's instincts, sharper than any civilized man's, twitched. He forgot the Vanir. He looked up. High above, silhouetted against the pale, sickly sky, something was circling. It looked like a tattered cloak caught in a whirlwind, or a prehistoric bat with wings of stretched, translucent skin. It made no sound as it dived. There was no rush of air, no scream of a predator. It was a silent death, falling from a silent heaven. Thorsier saw it a second too late. The chieftain reached for his shield, but the shadow was already upon them. Conan dove for the cover of a nearby crevice, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. As he rolled into the darkness of the rocks, he looked back. He saw one of the Vanir lifted clean off his feet, his body jerking upward into the air as if pulled by a fisherman's line. The man's legs kicked frantically against the empty air, his hands clawing at a pair of pale, multi-jointed talons that had pierced his chest. There was no scream, only the sight of the man's face, twisted in a final, soundless agony as he was carried up toward the Obsidian peaks. The hunt had begun. And in this valley, the loudest thing was the smell of fear. The crevice was narrow, a jagged split in the obsidian that smelled of ancient dust and the cold, metallic scent of the mountain's heart. From its shadows, Conan watched the camp dissolve into a ballet of butchery. The Vanir were broken. The sight of their comrade being plucked into the sky like a field mouse by a hawk had shattered the last of their iron discipline. 2 of them bolted, running blindly toward the valley's exit. They did not make it 20 paces. The shadow fell again, a blurred, pale shape that moved with a speed that defied its size. It did not land so much as collide with the earth. Even in the silence, Conan felt the impact through the soles of his boots, a heavy, dull thrum that vibrated up his shins. One warrior was crushed instantly beneath a pale, leathery torso. The other was swiped aside by a wing limb tipped with a hooked claw. The man spun through the air, his body limp as a rag doll, and slammed into a rock. He did not bounce, he simply crumpled, his skull shattered in a soundless explosion of red. The remaining 3 Vanir, led by Thorsier, did not run. There was no point. They turned toward the crevice where Conan lay hidden. To their fevered minds, the Cimmerian was the catalyst of this doom. He was the demon who had lured them into this silent trap. With a collective frantic lunge, they charged. Conan stepped out to meet them. It was the most surreal combat of his life. In the forests of Venarium or the streets of Shadazar, battle was a roar, a deafening cacophony of steel, screams, and the thundering of hearts. Here, it was a dream. Thorsir's lieutenant swung a heavy bearded axe. Conan saw the muscles in the man's forearms bunch, saw the wild, bloodshot desperation in his eyes. The Cimmerian stepped back, the blade of the axe passing inches from his chest. He felt the displaced air, a sharp, cold gust against his skin. But the expected whoosh of the swing was absent. It was as if he were fighting a ghost in a vacuum. Conan countered. His broadsword was a streak of cold light. He drove the point through the lieutenant's leather jack and into the soft tissue of the belly. He felt the resistance of the hide, the wet slide of the steel entering the viscera, and the jar of the tip catching on a vertebra. The Vanir's face contorted, his chest heaving in a silent gasp, his hands catching at Conan's blade in a futile attempt to hold his life inside. Conan twisted the steel and kicked the man away. The warrior fell back, his mouth open in a scream that never reached the air, his blood pumping out in thick, rhythmic jets that looked like black oil in the dim light. Thorseer and the last warrior came at him together. Thorseer was a veteran, his movements calculated even in his madness. He thrust with a short sword, while his companion swung a mace. Conan parried the mace, the vibration of the impact stinging his palm. Without the clack of wood on steel, the feedback was purely tactile, a jolt that traveled through his bones. He pivoted, using the momentum to shoulder charge the mace wielder. The man went down, and Conan didn't wait for him to rise. He brought his sword down in a two-handed overhead chop. The blade split the man's helm and the skull beneath it. The warrior's head parted like a ripe melon, but the only evidence was the spray of gray and red across Conan's furs. Now only Thorseer remained. The Vanir chieftain stood 10 feet away, his chest heaving, his sword arm trembling. He looked past Conan at the pale horror that was now feasting on the corpses in the center of the camp. The creature, the shuddering one, was hunched over its kill. Up close, it was a nightmare of antediluvian biology. It was hairless, its skin the color of a drowned corpse, stretched tight over a skeletal frame. It had no eyes, only a mass of sensitive, twitching whiskers and deep pit-like heat sensors where a face should be. Its wings were not feathered, but membranes of veined parchment, currently folded like a broken umbrella. It didn't eat like a wolf. It didn't tear. It pressed a lamprey-like orifice against the dead Vanir's chest and seemed to inhale, the body beneath it visibly shriveling as the creature drew out the heat and the fluids. Thorseer's resolve vanished. He didn't attack Conan. He didn't even look at him. He dropped his sword, the weapon hitting the ground with a soundless bounce, and fell to his knees, his hands clasped in prayer to a god who could not hear him. Conan did not kill him. He didn't even look at him. His blue eyes were fixed on the creature. The Cimmerian noticed something. The beast's head jerked every time Thorseer shifted his weight. When a loose stone rolled beneath Thorseer's knee, the creature's long, translucent ears flared. It didn't hear the stone, Conan realized. It felt the stone. The creature suddenly rose to its full, towering height. Its head swung back and forth like a dowsing rod. It sensed the two living hearts still beating in the depression. Conan's hand went to the hilt of his sword, but he did not draw it. He stood perfectly still, turning his body into a statue of bronze and fur. He even slowed his breathing, forcing his lungs to take in air with agonizing slowness. The beast took a step. The ground groaned, a sound Conan felt in his teeth, though his ears heard nothing. The creature was leaning toward Thorseer. The Vanir, in his religious ecstasy or terror, was trembling violently. The vibration of his shaking limbs was a beacon in the dark. The shuddering one lunged. It was a blur of pale limbs. Thorseer was gone in an instant, snatched up by the creature's secondary set of claws, smaller, human-like hands that sprouted from its chest. The chieftain was hoisted into the air, his silent prayer finally ending as the beast's maw closed over his shoulder. The creature didn't stay to finish its meal. With a powerful leap that sent a shockwave through the earth, it unfurled its tattered wings and caught an updraft that shouldn't have existed. It rose, a pale blot against the dark obsidian cliffs, carrying Thorseer toward the high, jagged spires at the valley's center. Conan remained in the shadow of the crevice for a long time, his heart finally slowing. The camp was a charnel house of silent meat. The Vanir were dead, their blood feud settled by a thing older than the hills. He looked at his sword. The blade was notched and stained. He wiped it clean on a tuft of frozen moss, the motion entirely soundless. He could leave now. He could climb back out of this cursed bowl and never look back. But he looked at the central spire where the creature had vanished. He thought of the Cimmerian steel the Vanir had stolen, the blade of his father's kin, now likely lying in a nest of bones. More than that, a cold iron anger burned in his chest. He hated this silence. He hated the way this thing hunted, stripping a man of his pride and his voice before taking his life. Conan the Cimmerian did not like being made to feel like a ghost. He would go to the spire, he would find the beast, and he would make it scream, even if the world itself had forgotten how. The camp was a graveyard of broken dolls. Conan stood amidst the carnage, the only thing in the valley that still possessed the heat of life. He looked at the bodies of the Vanir men he had hated, men he had hunted, and felt no triumph. To die in the roar of battle was a warrior's right. To be harvested like grain by a silent, sightless horror was blasphemy against the very nature of the North. He walked to the body of the lieutenant he had slain. The man's eyes were still open, glazed with a final, uncomprehending shock. Conan looked at the man's boots, heavy, fur-lined leather reinforced with iron hobnails. He looked at his own boots, similarly rugged. He realized now that their very equipment had been their undoing. Every step they had taken on the frozen, crystalline earth of this valley had been a dinner bell rung in the dark. In a land where sound did not exist, the earth itself had become the medium of communication. The strike of a heel, the scrape of a scabbard against a stone, these were not sounds here. They were ripples in a pond, and the shuddering one was the spider at the center of the web. Conan sheathed his sword, the action a smooth, tension-filled ghost of a movement. He knelt and began to strip the heavy furs from the dead Vanir. He removed his own brass-bound boots and set them aside. They were fine for the rocky passes of Cimmeria, but here they were hammers striking an anvil. He took the thickest wolf pelts from the Vanir's packs and began to wrap them around his feet, binding them tight with strips of rawhide. He created thick, soft pads that would swallow the impact of his weight. As he worked, he watched the central spire. It was a jagged tooth of obsidian that pierced the gray belly of the sky, 2 miles distant across a plain of fractured glass and frozen ash. The creature had carried Thorseer there. Whether the chieftain was dead or merely being kept as a larder for later, Conan did not know. But he knew that the Cimmerian blade, a heavy broadsword of ancient make, forged in the fires of his grandfather's time, was there, and Conan would not return to his people without it. He rose to his feet. He felt light, untethered. He tested a step. In the silence, he felt the difference. Usually, a step was a solid thing, a confirmation of existence. Now, with the thick fur muffling his stride, he felt as though he were treading on clouds. He moved out of the camp, his body low, his weight distributed with the practiced ease of a mountain cat. The plain was a nightmare of geometry. The obsidian floor had cracked into hexagonal plates, the edges sharp enough to flay a man's soul. Conan moved with agonizing slowness. He did not simply walk. He placed each foot with a deliberate, rolling motion, testing the stability of the ground before committing his full weight. He was halfway to the spire when the earth beneath him began to hum. It was not a sound, but a low-frequency tremor that vibrated through the soles of his padded feet and up into his jaw. He froze instantly, turning his body into a pillar of unmoving stone. High above, a pale shape drifted. The shuddering one was circling again. It did not use its wings to flap. It seemed to glide on the cold, stagnant air currents of the valley, its translucent membranes stretched wide. Its head was lowered, the sensitive whiskers on its snout twitching. Conan watched it with the cold, calculating eye of a hunter. The beast was sensing for a pulse, for the rhythmic thud of a heart or the careless scrape of a foot. 100 yards to Conan's left, a shard of ice, loosened by the creature's previous landing, finally gave way. It slid down the face of a small ridge and shattered against the obsidian floor. The reaction was instantaneous. The creature folded its wings and dropped. It didn't fly. It fell like a stone. It slammed into the ground near the shattered ice, the impact sending a massive shockwave through the valley floor that nearly knocked Conan from his feet. He dug his fingers into a crack in the rock, holding himself still by sheer muscular force. The beast prowled the area where the ice had fallen. It moved with a sickening, twitching gait, its multi-jointed limbs snapping into place with hydraulic precision. It leaned its head low to the ground, its face inches from the shards. It stayed there for a long minute, a pale, blind god of the waste, waiting for the vibration to repeat. Conan did not breathe. He did not blink. He knew that even the expansion of his chest might be enough to alert the horror if it were close enough. He waited, his muscles screaming for release, until the creature finally hissed, a soundless expulsion of air that rippled the dust, and leaped back into the sky with a powerful thrust of its legs. Once the tremors of its departure faded, Conan exhaled, a slow, controlled release. He looked at the spire. It was closer now, a monolithic shadow that seemed to drink what little light remained in the sky. He could see the openings in the rock, dark, jagged maws that led into the guts of the mountain. He began to move again, faster now, his pace dictated by the rhythm of the creature's patrol. He was no longer the hunter. He was the thief, the interloper in a kingdom of eternal stillness. As he reached the base of the spire, he found the first signs of the creature's long reign. The ground was littered with bones, not just of men and horses, but of things that had no name in the chronicles of the Hyborian age. Huge, rib-caged skeletons of prehistoric beasts, the chitinous husks of giant insects, and the delicate bird-like bones of some forgotten race of winged humanoids. All were picked clean, bleached white by the air of a valley that knew no decay. Conan looked up. The spire was not a natural formation. Up close, he could see the faint, eroded lines of masonry, cyclopean blocks of obsidian fused together by a heat that must have rivaled the sun. This had been a temple once, or a fortress, built by hands that were not human before the oceans drank Atlantis. He found a sloping ramp that led upward into the dark. He drew his sword, the cold weight of the steel a familiar comfort in his palm. He stepped into the mouth of the spire. The silence here was different, denser, older. It was the silence of a tomb that had been sealed for 10,000 years. And somewhere above him, in the heart of the black rock, the god of the hush was waiting for its next vibration. Conan began to climb, a shadow moving through a world of stone, his heart a muffled drum in the velvet dark. The interior of the spire was a hollow tooth of night. As Conan ascended the winding, stairless ramp, the air grew thinner and colder, tasting of ancient dust and something more pungent, the ozone of a lightning strike that had occurred 1,000 years ago. The walls were not merely obsidian. They were a singular, fused substance, smooth as silk and blacker than the pits of Stygia. In the dim, ambient light that filtered through narrow slits in the masonry, Conan saw his own reflection dogging his steps, a distorted, bronze-skinned phantom that seemed to watch him with more suspicion than his own mind possessed. He reached a vast, vaulted chamber halfway up the spire. Here, the architecture defied the logic of the Hyborian world. The pillars did not support the ceiling so much as they pierced it, angled like the ribs of a giant inverted beast. Hanging from the darkness of the ceiling were thousands of crystalline formations. They looked like icicles, but they glowed with a faint, pulsing phosphorescence. Conan paused, his sword arm tensed. As he moved past one, his shoulder brushed the crystal. The formation vibrated. It didn't ring, it didn't chime. Instead, a phantom image flickered within the crystal's facets. The face of a woman, her mouth open in a frantic, soundless cry. He touched another and saw the blurred image of a charging horse, its mane flowing, its eyes wide with terror. These were the bells of the hush. The spire was a reservoir, a place where the vibrations of the world were caught and stored in crystalline stasis, stripped of their sound and kept as trophies by the thing that ruled this height. It was a gallery of screams that could never be heard. Conan's lip curled in a silent snarl. To a Cimmerian, the dead should be buried or burned, their voices left to the wind. To trap them here, in this frozen, airless purgatory, was a crime that called for the edge of a blade. He pressed on, climbing higher until the ramp opened into the spire's summit. The chamber was a wide, circular platform open to the sky. In the center sat a throne, not of gold or marble, but of bleached, interlocking bones. Skulls of giants and rib cages of dragons were woven together with a grim architectural precision. And there, perched atop the ossuary throne, was the shuddering one. The beast was dormant. Its pale, leathery wings were folded tight against its skeletal ribs, making it look like a gargantuan, unhatched egg of some hellish bird. Its head was tucked beneath a wing joint, but even in its slumber, the sensitive whiskers on its snout twitched in rhythmic patterns, sensing the subtle shifts in the air. Conan's eyes shifted from the monster to the base of the throne. There, bound to a pillar of obsidian by thick, translucent webbing, was Thorseir. The Vanir chieftain was a ruin of a man. His fine mail had been shredded, and one of his shoulders was a mass of dark, clotted gore where the beast had fed. But his eyes were open. They were the eyes of a man who had looked into the abyss and found it staring back. Next to Thorseir, tossed carelessly onto a heap of discarded gear, was the Cimmerian blade. The sword was unmistakable, a heavy, double-edged broadsword with a crossguard of blackened iron and a pommel shaped like a wolf's head. It was a weapon forged for the grip of a giant, a relic of a time when the world was younger and more brutal. Conan moved. He did not look at the beast. He moved toward Thorseir, his padded feet whispering over the bone-strewn floor. The Vanir saw him, a flicker of something, hope, or perhaps a final defiant spark of hatred lit his bloodshot eyes. He watched as Conan reached the pillar. Conan did not speak. He could not. He reached out and gripped the webbing. It was cold and sticky, like the silk of a cave spider, but infinitely stronger. He brought his own sword down in a slow, sawing motion, the steel biting through the magical cordage. Thorseir slumped forward as the last strand parted. Conan caught him, his powerful arms supporting the weight of the massive Northman. For a long moment, the two enemies stood in the center of the monster's lair. In the lands below, they would have been at each other's throats, fueled by generations of border raids and blood feuds. Here, in the heart of the iron silence, they were merely two creatures of flesh and blood, standing against a nightmare from the dawn of time. Conan looked Thorseir in the eye. He gave a sharp, imperious nod toward the exit. "Go." Thorseir shook his head. He reached down, his trembling hand closing around the hilt of his own notched axe which lay nearby. He looked at the sleeping beast, then back at Conan. He didn't want to flee. He wanted a reckoning. Conan felt a grim, silent respect for the Vanir. He reached out and grabbed the Cimmerian heirloom from the pile of loot. The weight of his father's steel in his hand felt like a bolt of lightning through his arm. He felt the balance, the familiar pull of the iron. He didn't sheathe his current sword. He stood with a blade in each hand, the blue-tempered steel of the south and the black iron of the north. He turned toward the throne. The shuddering one chose that moment to wake. It didn't stir slowly. One moment it was a statue of pale parchment. The next, its wings snapped open with a force that sent a physical shockwave through the chamber. Its head whipped around. The heat sensors in its face flared a dull, angry red. It didn't need eyes to see the two interlopers. It felt the heat of their blood. It felt the frantic, heavy pounding of their hearts. Conan braced his legs, his muscles bunching like coiled cables. He saw the beast's throat swell as it prepared to let out a soundless scream. He looked at Thorseir. The Vanir raised his axe. They had no words for a battle cry. They had no songs to bolster their courage. There was only the cold, hard logic of the blade. The beast lunged from its throne of bone, a pale shadow of death. Conan stepped forward to meet it, his father's sword leading the way. The silence was about to be broken, if not by sound, then by the spray of ancient, Icarus blood. The shuddering one did not move with the clumsy weight of a beast its size. It moved with the twitchy, instantaneous speed of a mountain adder. It lunged from its throne of bone, its pale limbs snapping outward like a folding chair being kicked open. Conan threw himself to the left, the stone floor biting into his shoulder as he rolled. He felt a sudden, violent displacement of air, a silent wind that smelled of ancient dust and stagnant musk, as the creature's primary talons raked the space where his head had been a heartbeat. Thorcir was less agile. The Vanir staggered, his wounded shoulder slowing him, but he managed to bring his axe up in a desperate parry. The beast's secondary, human-like hand sprouted from its chest and caught the haft of the axe. With a casual flick of its wrist, the monster sent Thorcir spinning across the chamber, his weapon clattering soundlessly to the obsidian floor. Conan surged to his feet, a blade in each hand. He didn't wait for the creature to reset. He stepped in, his father's iron broadsword leading a savage diagonal cut aimed at the beast's pale, distended belly. The blade bit deep. Conan felt the resistance of the hide, leathery and tough as cured shark skin, and then the sickening slide as the steel found the soft viscera beneath. A thick, viscous ichor, black as night, sprayed across his chest. The beast reacted not with a roar, but with a physical convulsion. Its body buckled, and it lashed out with a wing joint. The blow caught Conan in the ribs, sending him flying backward. He slammed into a pillar, the air leaving his lungs in a silent gasp. For a moment, his vision swam with red sparks. He realized then that he could not win this through brute force alone. Every strike he landed only provoked a faster, more erratic response from the horror. It was too fast, its senses too attuned to the rhythm of his movements. In this silence, its very heartbeat was a drum the beast could follow. I must blind it, Conan thought, his mind racing through the red haze of his rage. Not its eyes, for it has none. I must blind its sense of the earth. He scrambled up, his eyes darting around the chamber. He saw what he needed. Near the edge of the circular platform, where the spire opened to the gray sky, was a massive, rusted iron chain. It was as thick as a man's thigh, its links fused with the same ancient heat that had forged the spire. It ran from a heavy iron winch set into the floor, up to a colossal block of obsidian that hung precariously over the abyss, a counterweight for some long-forgotten mechanism. The chain was under immense tension. Every few seconds it gave a minute, agonizing groan that Conan felt in the marrow of his teeth, though his ears heard nothing. Conan looked at Thorcir. The Vanir was on his knees, clutching his side, his face a mask of agony. Conan caught the man's gaze and made a sharp pulling motion with his hand, pointing toward the heavy obsidian pin that locked the winch. Thorcir understood. The barbarian's eyes, blue and gray respectively, met in a moment of shared lethal intent. Conan turned back to the shuddering one. He didn't hide, he didn't sneak. He began to stomp. He brought his padded feet down with as much force as he could muster, intentionally sending vibrations thrumming through the obsidian floor. He beat his father's sword against his own chest, the impact a rhythmic, physical thud that he knew the beast would feel as a blinding strode light in its dark world. The creature's head whipped toward him. Its whiskers twitched frantically, its heat sensors locking on to the massive, pulsing target that was the Cimmerian. It hissed, a soundless spray of black mist, and crouched low, its powerful hind legs tensing for a final, killing leap. Conan backed away, drawing the beast toward the center of the platform, away from the winch. He was the bait. The shuddering one launched itself. It was a pale, soaring blur of death. "Now!" Conan screamed in his mind. At the edge of the spire, Thorsier threw the whole weight of his body against the obsidian pin. The Vanir roared with the effort, his wounded muscles tearing further, but his barbarian strength did not fail. The pin snapped. The winch spun. The massive iron chain did not merely move, it lashed. The obsidian counterweight plummeted into the abyss, and the thousands of pounds of iron chain whipped through the chamber with the force of a falling mountain. The vibration was cataclysmic. Even without sound, the shock wave was physical. The floor buckled. The bells of ice in the chamber below surely shattered by the thousands. The very air seemed to ripple with the sheer, violent energy of the chain's release. To the shuddering one, it must have been as if the sun had exploded within its brain. The creature, caught mid-leap, suddenly lost all sense of direction. It flailed in the air, its wings snapping shut and then open in a chaotic, frantic rhythm. It slammed into the floor, not with a landing, but with a crash, its limbs jerking as it was overwhelmed by the sensory storm. It was deafened and blinded by the roar of the earth itself. Conan did not hesitate. He sprang. He moved through the vibrating air like a thunderbolt. He saw the beast's long, pale neck exposed as it thrashed in its sensory madness. He brought both swords down. The blue steel of the south and the black iron of the north met in a singular, devastating arc. They bit into the monster's throat, meeting in the center of its spine. With a primal, gut-wrenching heave, Conan twisted the blades. The beast's head came free. The shuddering one's body went limp, its massive wings draping over the throne of bone like a funeral shroud. Black ichor gushed from the stump of its neck, pooling in the crevices of the floor. Conan stood over the carcass, his chest heaving, his hands trembling with the aftershock of the kill. He looked at the severed head, its whiskers still twitching in a dying, pathetic rhythm. The silence remained, but for the first time since he had entered the valley, the silence felt empty. The presence was gone. The god was dead. He looked toward the winch. Thorsier lay slumped against the iron housing, his breathing ragged. The Vanir looked at Conan, and for a brief, fleeting second, the chieftain's lips quirked into a bloody, triumphant grin. Conan did not smile back. He merely wiped his blades on the creature's pale hide and began the long walk toward his kin's steel. The iron silence was over, but the mountain still had its price to collect. The beast was dead, but the valley was not yet finished with the living. Conan stood over the decapitated ruin of the shuddering one, his father's broadsword gripped in a hand slick with black, oily ichor. He expected the usual rush of triumph, the surge of heat that followed a kill. Instead, he felt a sickening pressure behind his eyes. The silence had changed. It was no longer a hollow void. It was a tightening coil. Across the chamber, Thorsier dragged himself upright against the winch. The Vanir's face was a mask of agony, his eyes darting toward the ceiling. Conan followed his gaze. The thousands of crystalline bells hanging from the vaulted heights were no longer glowing with a soft phosphorescence. They were vibrating with such intensity that they blurred into shimmering ghosts. Within their facets, the trapped images, the screaming women, the dying horses, the clashing armies of a dozen forgotten ages were moving in a frenzied, overlapping blur. The Hush of Crom was not a natural phenomenon. It was a dam. and Conan, by shattering the great chain and slaying the creature that anchored the spell, had breached it. He felt it first in his teeth, a high-frequency ache that made his jaw throb. Then came the pressure in his ears, a stabbing pain as if iron needles were being driven into his skull. He dropped his swords, his hands flying to his head, his mouth opening in a roar that he still could not hear. Then the world broke. It began with a sound like a single, microscopic hairline fracture in a sheet of infinite glass. It was a tink, so small, so sharp, it felt like a needle pricking the brain. Then the tink became a crack. The crack became a roar. The silence did not lift. It exploded. 10,000 years of stolen sound, of suppressed screams, of unuttered prayers, and the thunder of long-dead storms came rushing back into the world all at once. The transition was a physical blow. The air in the chamber didn't just move, it hammered. Conan was thrown to his knees. His eardrums didn't just pop, they felt as though they had been seared by white-hot brands. The noise was a solid wall of agony, a cacophony of overlapping shrieks, the grinding of tectonic plates, and the psychic wail of every soul the Shuddering One had ever consumed. He saw Thorsier collapse, the Vanir's hands clamped over his ears as blood began to leak from between his fingers. The Obsidian spire, built on the foundations of that unnatural silence, could not withstand the return of vibration. The walls began to spiderweb with fractures. The bells in the ceiling shattered, raining down shards of glowing crystal that sang with the dying echoes of the voices they had held. Move or die, the primal core of Conan's mind commanded, though the thought was nearly drowned out by the psychic roar. He lunged for Thorsier, grabbing the massive Northman by the collar of his mail and heaving him toward the spiraling ramp. Every step was a battle against vertigo. The world was spinning, the very floor beneath him humming with a resonance that threatened to liquefy his bones. They reached the ramp just as the throne of bone collapsed. The skulls of giants clattered down the obsidian steps, their impact now a deafening series of thuds that shook the very core of the mountain. "Run!" Conan bellowed. The sound of his own voice was a shock. It was a hoarse, ragged thing, raw from disuse, but it was the most beautiful thing he had ever heard. It was proof he was alive. It was the roar of a lion in a world that had tried to turn him into a shadow. They descended the ramp in a mad, tumbling rush. Around them, the spire was disintegrating. Great blocks of fused obsidian were shearing off the walls, crashing into the abyss below with the sound of falling stars. The dust was a choking gray shroud, illuminated by the dying flickers of the shattered soul crystals. They reached the central chamber, the gallery where Conan had first seen the bells. It was a vortex of noise. The very air was shimmering with the force of the sound waves. Conan saw a massive pillar shatter, not from weight, but from the sheer harmonic frequency of the screaming echoes. He didn't look back. He shoved Thorsier toward the outer ramp, the way leading down to the valley floor. Behind them, the heart of the spire gave way. With a sound like the world being torn in half, the upper reaches of the tower tilted and began to fall. Conan and Thorsier leaped from the final ledge just as the ramp beneath them vanished into the dark. They hit the frozen ash of the valley floor, rolling and tumbling as the ground heaved. The spire collapsed in a slow-motion nightmare of black stone and white dust. The impact was cataclysmic, A plume of pulverized obsidian shot hundreds of feet into the air, and the resulting shock wave knocked the breath from Conan's lungs. For a long time, Conan lay face down in the ash. His ears were ringing with a high, steady whine that masked all other sound, but beneath it, he could hear the wind. It was a real wind, a cold, biting northern gale that howled through the high passes and whistled over the jagged rocks. It wasn't the hush, it was the voice of the mountain. He rolled onto his back, gasping for air. The sky above was no longer that sickly, stagnant gray. The clouds were moving, torn by the storm, and for a brief second he saw the cold, uncaring stars of the north. Thorsier was a few yards away, curled in a fetal position. He was alive, though his breathing was a wet, ragged rattle. He had lost his hearing. The blood on his neck was testament to that. But he was breathing the air of a world that made sense again. Conan sat up and looked at his hands. He still held his father's sword. The black iron pommel, shaped like a wolf's head, seemed to gleam in the starlight. The iron silence was broken. The valley was no longer a tomb. As the dust began to settle, Conan felt the weight of his exhaustion. His body was a map of bruises. His ribs were cracked, and his head felt as though it had been beaten with a smith's hammer. But as he looked at the ruins of the spire, he felt a strange, grim satisfaction. He had walked into the mouth of a god's silence and spat into its eye. He had brought the roar of life back to a place of death. He stood up, his legs shaking but holding. He walked over to Thorsier and offered a hand. The Vanir looked up, his eyes glassy and unfocused. He saw the Cimmerian, the man who should have been his enemy, the man who had dragged him out of the dark. Thorsier took the hand. Conan hauled him up, the two of them standing amidst the wreckage of a nightmare. "The mountain speaks again, Vanir," Conan said, though he knew the man could not hear him. He turned his back on the ruins and began the long trek toward the stone markers at the valley's edge. He did not look back. He had his steel, he had his life, and he had the wind. For a Cimmerian, it was more than enough. In the distance, a wolf howled. It was a lonely, savage sound, filled with hunger and cold. Conan threw back his head and laughed, a deep, booming sound that echoed off the cliffs and rose into the winter sky. It was a loud laugh. It was a defiant laugh. And in the hush of Crom, it was the only sound that mattered. The trek to the valley's rim was a journey through a world being reborn in agony. Every sliding pebble was a thunderclap. Every ragged breath from Thorsier's throat was the rasp of a saw against bone. To Conan's battered ears, the return of sound was not a gift, but a physical assault. Yet he welcomed it. The ringing in his head was a small price to pay for the privilege of hearing his own pulse. They reached the stone markers, the ancient, lichen-crusted monoliths that defined the borders of the Hush, just as the sun began to dip behind the Iglophian peaks. The sky was a bruised purple, bleeding gold at the edges. As they crossed the invisible line, the last of the unnatural pressure snapped. It felt like a bubble bursting inside Conan's skull. Suddenly, the mountain was no longer a silent film. It was a roaring, living beast. The wind, which had been a mere vibration in the valley, now shrieked through the crags with a savage, beautiful fury. The scent of pine and wet earth rushed into Conan's nostrils, replacing the stale ozone of the spire. Conan stopped, and leaned against one of the monoliths, his father's sword sheathed at his hip, the weight of the black iron a grounding presence. He watched the dust cloud from the collapsed spire settle into the bowl of the valley. The god in the well was buried under 1,000,000 tons of obsidian. Thorcir stumbled to a halt beside him. The Vanir was a ghost of the man who had entered the valley. His yellow hair was matted with blood and ash, and his eyes, though no longer mad, were vacant. He looked at Conan, his head cocked to one side as he strained to hear the wind. He could not. The hush had claimed his hearing as its final tithe. Slowly, painfully, Thorcir reached out a hand. It was an offer of peace, a gesture of brotherhood forged in the gut of a nightmare. Conan looked at the hand, then up at the Vanir's scarred face. In any other hour, they would have been locked in a death struggle, their blood staining the snow. But the Cimmerian felt a strange, cold weariness. He had seen enough of the silent dead this day. Conan did not take the hand. Instead, he reached out and gripped the Vanir's forearm in a brief, iron-hard squeeze of acknowledgement. He leaned in, speaking loud enough for the vibration to be felt, if not heard. "Go back to your people, Aesir Slayer," Conan growled. "Tell them the hush is gone. Tell them the shuddering one is meat. And tell them if they ever fire another Cimmerian camp, I will not bring them to a valley of silence. I will bring them a mountain of screams." Thorcir did not understand the words, but he understood the steel in the Cimmerian's eyes. He nodded once, a slow, jerky motion, and turned toward the north. He walked with a limp, a solitary figure disappearing into the rising mist of the highlands. Conan watched him go until the Vanir was nothing more than a speck against the snow. Then the Cimmerian turned his face toward the south. High above, a lone wolf cresting a ridge let out a long, mournful howl that echoed through the pass. To a civilized man, it might have sounded like a dirge. To Conan, it was a song, a raw, vibrant testament to the chaotic, noisy, and bloody world he called home. He adjusted his furs, felt the familiar ache of his wounds, and began the long descent. He did not look back at the valley. Crom did not care for the past, and Conan had no breath to waste on prayers. He walked into the night, his boots finally making the heavy, honest sound of a man treading upon his own earth.